Welcome around the work stand.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's that time again. Here's Ryan, Mr. Not world traveler, but certainly continental U.S. traveler.
I tell you what, I covered some ground over a couple of weeks. You know, I had the two work events, but then I don't know if it was selfish. Yeah, it was selfishly. I did a whole camping trip through Arizona, Southern California, Nevada, between the two events. It was fantastic. I highly recommend, between intense conferences, to go into the middle of nowhere and camp.
I think going to the middle of nowhere would be good advice for lots of people occasionally.
Yeah. Generally.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to find nowhere these days.
Yeah, it is. I tell you what, that's a cool part of the country. Mojave, Death Valley. Death Valley in particular. It's a long ways away, but I'll be going back. It's epic terrain.
When you say Death Valley to somebody from SEC football country, we just think about Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where LSU
really?
plays their football games. Well, I'm not an LSU fan. I'm pretty sure that's it. Anyway, you should have some good information relative to the suppliers and the brands and some retailers after these conferences and visits. So, let us know what's going on with that.
Yeah, I had a lot of conversations and, oh boy, I bet 20 seminars over the course of 2 weeks. But yeah, I was at Bicycle Leadership Conference in Tucson, which is the kind of supplier focused trade show. I think there was only one retailer there, Eric, who runs Eric's Bike and Board, I think is what it's called. And then there was the NBDA Retailer Summit in Vegas and then CABDA West in Vegas. It was great. I mean, it was just really nice to connect with people and figure out kind of what's their sense of the market. What are they excited about? What are they worried about? I definitely walked away with a few themes. It's not going to be a surprise to anybody that uncertainty was the word of the day among suppliers, because that's the side of the business that tends to, need to. The tariffs have the most direct impact. The tariffs impact everybody, but they're the ones who have to figure out, how do they budget for it? When do they pay it? How do they need to adjust ordering, logistics, pricing? I mean, that's the one that I think a lot of our listeners are going to care about the most is, how is it going to impact, their wholesale and retail pricing? And I'll tell you what, you're not allowed to kind of talk too much about pricing at those events. But there's just, it's unknown, that uncertainty thing comes in of, you don't know what's going to stick, what's not going to stick. It just changes so much, and all anybody wants is some sort of clarity. And it's just not, obviously some clarity came out late last week, but it's still really in flux.
And for the suppliers, it's an immediate and unplanned requirement of cash, right? And
there's absolutely, they got to write a check.
Some importers that on small tariff things will help with terms, but generally they got to stroke checks real quick.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And, and a lot of the industry over the last several years moved production out of China and into Vietnam, and Vietnam's, dramatically impacted. Taiwan's impacted. Japan's impacted. There's separate tariffs on steel and aluminum, which can include some finished goods. The tariffs stack on each other. There's this deal where there's an additional surcharge on containers that are imported either on a cargo ship that was manufactured in China or owned by a Chinese company. And so keeping it all straight is just nearly impossible. And then, of course, you're dealing with inflation, on their end as well, in terms of, the inputs that they put into their business. So it's just a really tough time, at a time when the bike industry is still trying to find its footing.
Yeah. So how did that seem to carry over with the retailers? Is there still some sense of, when it gets here, or is there real trepidation? Or are they talking about how quick can we pull some sales forward just in case this lasts long? What is the sentiment amongst our clients, the merchants?
It was a pretty diverse group. I would say the primary sentiment is not paying a lot of attention to it. I think that there's the concept of tariffs, there's the concept of inflation, but I didn't hear many dealers talking about it. I think the only things that I heard were largely based on, I'll say anticipatory frustration with suppliers raising prices. I think that the supply side of the business, there's a big opportunity for transparency in terms of like what goes into the price of a product. Because amongst dealers, there was a general frustration that it was going to be a game of not it in terms of who takes a margin hit. But and I think, and the same came out of CABDA too, of like, I think dealers are just focused on the positive. Where can we find some success? But I don't think that they can necessarily afford, from their own morale standpoint or their employees' morale, to be too, lost in the kind of challenges that sit for business. I think they need to go into the spring with vigor and enthusiasm. And so that's likely what, kind of clouding what I picked up from the conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'll tell you, I think, we're just going to have to expect that, there's going to be a pricing impact for consumers on bike product. But I've said this before, the bike product is a secondary concern for me. The primary concern is how it's going to impact everyday purchases for consumers and what that's going to do for discretionary budgets. And so we're going to be keeping a close eye. I mean, it's going to be a day by day, week by week thing to try and see when does that show up at the Walmarts of the world and that sort of thing.
Because there is a bit of a delay for, I don't remember the exact rules, but things in transit, if they've gotten to a certain point, then they're free of the new tariff. If they're not at that point, it's inclusive. And I've read some articles where there's suppliers asking the manufacturers to hold up. If it can't make it by X date, hold that. So I guess we have to work our way through that before we know exactly when these things make it to the retail floor.
Yep. Yeah. And then there's been, I'd say intentional front loading in kind of the general retail segment. If Walmart might bring in 30% more big screen TVs than they would have otherwise. On the bike industry side, I think there's some carryover overstock, and sales velocity wasn't great last year. And so there's inventory that won't directly be impacted. But the suppliers are going to need to cost average. So it's not like a bike that, if import tariffs are impacting new deliveries, those prices are going to be applied to existing inventory as well. But it might let them moderate it to some extent. But then I think things like, back to the consumer side, it's going to show up at the grocery store really quickly because you can't front load vegetables. Yeah. So it's and if you look at things like meats, the farmers' inputs costs are going to go up, and so they're that. Even though you don't import the cow, you might import the feed or the, the things you need in order to raise the livestock, and so it's just going to be a really confusing time. Yeah.
Well, what about the products and the sales that are going on? Did you hear about trends? I mean, let's review at some point. We know our numbers for the last month. What are you seeing in our platform, and then out larger?
Yeah, I mean, there's good news on both fronts, meaning, there's a lot of optimism on where some potential growth might come from for the industry. I think there a lot of attention's going towards throttle e-bikes, and language around this category is shifting. I think traditionally we've said class 2 e-bikes, but I think for better or for worse, the market has pulled a lot of consumers into out of class product. So throttle e-bikes are really where there's expected to be some growth. There's a lot of product information, a lot of high quality product that's coming in at lower retail prices with high margins. And so dealers, they're very attracted to where's the consumer demand and where are the good margins at. As dealers were looking at possible recessionary conditions ahead, or really across the board, There was talk about the impact that used or pre-owned can have on helping find success in that market. So I think you're going to see a lot more attention paid there. A lot of attention from dealers on just focusing on profitability. What are the things that they're going to stock that are going to give us the highest turns? It was really flattering that at the NBDA Retailer Summit, there was a block of retailers that presented on profitability and unsolicited. Each of them talked about the impact that Workstand IQ has on their business, which is the service we have that's open to buy planning and helps them maximize profitability on inventory. So that, a lot of attention going towards that. I think I saw a lot of note taking happening in the room. A lot of interest in e-commerce. I've been kind of going back and forth on what's the primary impact of our application on our customers. And as we've all talked about, foot traffic tends to be the piece that gets the most attention right now. But there was a lot more openness in terms of diversifying revenue streams. It's not just how do I get in front of customers on Google to drive floor traffic, but increasingly it's, I'd love to pick up some e-commerce sales. And so
Nice.
that's another area where, it's hard to pin down, kind of from our point of view, the market, or the retailers, what they're looking for.
Yeah. Speaking of e-commerce, we have some, I think, March numbers across our platform.
Yeah.
Let's go talk about that.
Yeah. US did great in March. Up 9% in sales. Order volume was up.
Nice.
Different story in Canada, unfortunately. Canadian market on our platform has really suffered in March. It was down 18% in dollars, but order volume is down over 30%. The overall retail numbers, just outside of bikes also come out for March, and Canadian retail overall was down, I think 0.2 to 0.5%. But a lot of that was bolstered by auto sales. And we see that happening in the US too, of consumers really trying to get ahead of any sort of tariff impact on pricing. And so we're going to see auto sales be really strong in April here. But sporting goods, when you kind of drill into the data in Canada, sporting goods were down about 7%. So it looks like bike are being impacted slightly more, but in general, that's that kind of discretionary area. But in the US, great growth in mountain and road in those price bands we've talked about before, kind of the mid-priced aluminum road bikes, wider tires, whether it's classified as a gravel or an all-road. But then also somewhat shockingly, comfort and commuter bikes were strong, which is a category that has been just tanking in the last 2 years. Because that's, I think, as much as anything, like those two categories kind of fall into that pull forward class. But maybe, some of that inventory or some of the bikes that have been sitting in garages are buried behind other things at this point. So they're not hitting the used market, and you got kind of a new wave of consumers coming into bike shops. So some good news on those fronts.
Nice.
Do you think, because I have heard from a few Canadian merchants who sell primarily American bike brands, that there's been some localized pushback on those brands, which I would imagine would be a temporary, knee-jerk reflex. But have you heard, or could that be contributing to the fact that bikes maybe are down a little more than other sporting goods areas of that?
I think that is a possibility. I've had a number of conversations, either both at CABDA, but also I've placed some phone calls to suppliers and retailers in the Canadian market, just because I'm worried about the same thing. And, I have heard that consumers aren't wanting to buy a US made or a US brand product. But that isn't across the board. Most of the dealers that I called are not experiencing that, and neither are suppliers. While at the same time, they say that the Buy Canadian sentiment is growing. So it's hard to say whether or not what we're seeing is, are we overrepresented in, say, a Trek and Specialized product versus a Norco Rocky Mountain product in terms of the dealer makeup that we work with. So we might be getting the wrong signal, but it's hard. We don't know.
So any other interesting topics or trends that you saw at these meetings?
So tying together a couple of things, when, I was a part of that data and research panel, and on that panel is a gentleman from Circana, and Circana does the primary reporting in the bike industry, but also just broader global retail. And the health and beauty category for them is like, that is the driving force for retail sales growth right now. And so there's a lot of discussion on like, well, how do we connect cycling, which is fundamentally health driven, feel better, look better, fresh air. Is there any way to tie into some of those underlying consumer wants that are driving the health and beauty segment into cycling? And how do we make cycling cool? Because a lot of the other drivers for health and beauty is that it's such a strong industry on social media. And I think we have the cool factor down for nerds like the three of us. We have plenty of stuff to find in our feeds. But what about the average consumer, like somebody who might be interested in yoga? Are they also seeing cycling? So there were a lot of questions around how do we market and position cycling to grow?
Ryan, you recently shared, I think on a Monday email to the team, an article.
You're referring to my rant earlier this week?
Yeah, I didn't know if we're like outwardly letting people know that you give us a rant. But it's the ramble, but...
Well, there's that, but I mean, I ranted on LinkedIn too. I mean, I don't know. I tried to stay in the realm of professional, but I was super frustrated, cup of coffee Monday morning and jumped on Instagram and started flipping through people's stories, and like a number of cycling influencers had this screenshot of a Cyclingnews article that really disparaged Specialized and them advocating for for tariffs. I read the article and it was just totally misguided. They conflated DeMinimis reform with tariffs, and even worse, they took the testimony of Bob Margevicius, who is a senior VP for Specialized, just an exceptional representative for the bicycle industry, the person who spends the time with European trade associations, Asian trade associations. Nobody knows production or import, just general trade issues like Bob. 2 weeks ago, the guy wins the Lifetime Achievement Award for People for Bikes. And then the Cyclingnews author totally mischaracterized his testimony, got just lost in this justifiable frustration with tariff policy, and really threw Bob under the bus. And it just incredibly frustrates me that a clickbait article, it worked. I mean, it got people sharing on social media just as a way to kind of hate on a brand, but Bob's name got dragged through it. And so I want our audience to know that, like, don't fall for it. It's a compelling headline, but DeMinimis reform is important for the bike industry. When it's a confusing issue, go to my LinkedIn account and you'll see a post that links to a good way to learn more about it. Okay. But it basically is just, it sets a price threshold on imports where that can bypass tariffs. And so it's an $800 threshold. And that is the whole reason that the company Temu gained traction here. That's the reason that you got unsafe $5 helmets going into consumer hands and lights for $2. And it's the major contributing factor for, super low quality direct to consumer e-bikes hitting. And so there's a reason the bike industry is trying to lower that threshold, and it's good for our customers. Our customers are losing sales. Their high quality product is being devalued. So just be thoughtful and do your research before you share the clickbait, because it's sending the wrong signal to consumers. And it really bums me out. And to have such a good guy's name dragged through the mud is just, it's shameful.
That's tough to see. Yeah. I think that's a good takeaway. We're real deep in the doom scrolling phase of life. And so maybe just a little check-in.
Yeah. And now I gotta stop with the coffee and calm down again.
Yeah. Have you eaten yet to balance out that caffeine consumption?
I have.
Okay. Just checking. Well, I think we got some ups and downs right now, but excited to see that U.S. sales are up. hopefully that continues. I think retailers really staying on the gas. We talk about marketing. It's a numbers game. Do what you can to stay in front of customers, stay top of mind. The weather is looking fantastic here in the next couple of weeks. So I hope to see more people out on bikes.
Same. And, you know, times are stressful and people, you know, they may flock to the things that bring them joy. We may have a great bike season. And I think we should all be optimistic despite the headwinds.
Yes. Ooh, headwinds. Ugh.
Sorry,
I'll take a headwind over a crosswind any day, though. Anyway, well, I guess we'll see you around the work stand.